We come to our chapter in Genesis, chapter 16, in our studies of the life of faith and the life of Abraham, and thinking today of the dominant theme of this chapter, which I would argue is listening. And our ear, this sense organ, which makes it possible for us to hear, is one of our most important senses. It enables us to communicate with one another through speech. The development of speech itself is heavily dependent on our ability to hear. Children learn to talk by listening to and imitating the speech of those who are older. Hearing alerts us to danger. The honk of a horn, the whistle of an approaching train makes us aware of something coming. Even while asleep, we can hear perhaps the barking of a watchdog or the fire alarm alerts us even in our sleep. But in addition to these common and useful aspects of our hearing provides us with pleasure. It enables us to enjoy music, the sound of birds singing, the surf crashing. Hearing is a complicated process within our beings, as we know. Everything that moves makes some sound. Vibrations travel in waves. Sound waves enter our ear, change into nerve signals that are sent to our brain. The brain interprets the signals as sounds. There's more to our ear than this fleshy bit carved on the side of our heads. Our outer ear, our middle ear, our inner ear. Our focus today is on this aspect of listening. Listening is the theme of this 16th chapter. We read in verse 2 that Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. He used his ears to listen to her words. The vibrating airwaves caused by the sound of Sarai's voice entered into Abraham's outer ear, then into his inner ear, and then into his middle ear. Her words entered into the cochlear, which transmits the impulses to the temporal lobe. He was hearing the words of his wife. But the fact that this very same phrase is used of Adam in the Garden of Eden in chapter 3, verse 17, when Eve was encouraging him to do wrong by eating of the forbidden fruit, alerts us that what Abraham is listening to and responding to might be wrong. The echo of that tragic moment in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:17 is heard here in chapter 16 and in verse 2. And so Abraham was listening in one way. But he's not the only person listening in this chapter, is he? In chapter 16 and verse 11, we read, "The Lord listened to your affliction." The same Hebrew word is used in both verses, but used in very different ways. Here the Lord is listening to the affliction of this servant girl. The word Ishmael at the end of our chapter emphasizes this dominant theme. El for God at the end, Shema meaning hear in Hebrew. The word Ishmael means God hears, emphasizing that the dominant theme of chapter 16 of Genesis is listening. Abraham is listening, and the Lord is listening. In our studies of Abraham, we've traced his beginnings in Mesopotamia, called by God into the land of Canaan, his sally down into Egypt, and his separation from Lot, his nephew, then his wonderful defeat of the conglomerate of 4 Mesopotamian kings, that tremendous covenant set of promises which God gave to him in chapter 15. And now we come to this episode in Abram's life. I'll argue it's a moment of weakness, but in this experience, we learn. And so the message from this chapter, the take-home truth for us all today is, are you listening? But in what way are you listening? And to whom are you listening? Are you listening like Abraham? Or are you listening like Jesus? So let's think first of all of bad listening, and then think secondly of good listening. We have a little map which might help you geographically. Here, the mention of Shur, where Hagar runs to, is there. It's just in the north of Africa, there in Egypt. She's on her way from the land of Canaan down to Shur, where the Lord meets with her. So let's think first of all of bad listening in verses 1 to 6. First type of listening mentioned here, I'm arguing, is the wrong type of listening. That is the listening of Abraham in verses 1 to 6. And we've already alluded to us being alerted to the style of listening which Abraham's engaged in here by the echo from Genesis 3:17 that we find in verse 2. The same Hebrew phrase is used. Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Adam listened to the voice of his wife Eve. So this event in the life of Abraham is a mistake. It's a wrong turn. It's a backward step. It's an error. It's a sin. The chapter's in contrast to the good that we saw in Abraham in chapter 15. He was listening well there. But in this chapter, he's listening badly. And that's how it is in our Christian life, isn't it? The Christian life has been likened to a flower which begins as a seed and then progresses into its full bloom. But all of us know that it's not a straight line. There should be progression. There should be development. At the end of our Christian lives, we should be more godly, more advanced, more mature than at the beginning. But it is not a straight line from beginning to end. Every athlete competing in the Olympic Games will tell you that their standing on the podium with their gold, silver, or bronze has not been plain sailing. There have been disappointments, there have been setbacks, but they have persevered and they have achieved their goal. And so we're learning in this chapter today that in the life of Abraham, where there is so much that is admirable and commendable, there are also mistakes, wrong turns, bad decisions, listening to poor advice. And as it was with Abraham, so it is with us. We say, we think, we do what is wrong. We make bad decisions. We listen to wrong counsel. There are things that we wish we never said or did or thought as Abraham did. But he goes on. He perseveres. He follows in the life of faith. So what type of voice then was he listening to in verse 2? A desperate voice, a reasoned voice, and a worldly voice. A desperate voice. Here was Sarai. She was 75 years old. Her husband, Abraham, was 85 years old. She's reasoning that if they are to have an heir, if there is the family name is to be carried on, then it will not be by her, it will be by someone else. In verse 2 we read, "The Lord has prevented me from bearing children." She considered her circumstances. Perhaps she'd been praying for a child. But nothing had changed in her circumstances. And now she is desperate. They're getting older. Something has to be done. And so she takes matters into her own hands. She jumps the gun. She comes up with a practical solution to the situation that they are in. Like many of us, we think that God's timing should parallel our timing. But she will learn, and we can see in her experience, that just around the corner, was this incredible transformation of her circumstances. That she could only wait and trust and pray and believe. If we could only wait and trust and pray and believe, God will work out his gracious purpose in his way, in his time. So Abram was listening to a desperate voice. Something has to be done now. God is saying it'll be done in my time. In 5 years' time it would be. Or 15 years' time. She was saying it has to be done now. It's a reasoned voice. We can't be too critical of Sarai, this woman of faith. There she is. She has these promises from God, which we've been learning about in chapter 15, chapter 12, that through the offspring of Abraham, the nations would be blessed. She wants that to happen. She's thinking of us. She's thinking of the myriads of lands far beyond the land of Canaan. They were well traveled. They knew that there was more to the world than this sliver of land at the side of the Mediterranean Sea. There was vast nations all over the earth, and she wanted them to be blessed. She didn't want them to miss out on these tremendous promises of God. Behind her solution is this spiritual vision and aim. And besides, it hadn't been specified that the offspring of Abraham would come from Sarah. That happens in chapter 18. But Abraham and Sarai don't know that yet. The promise is that from the offspring of Abraham, blessings will come. So here she is, with all these desires and challenges and vision. She longs for the nations to be blessed. She has the promise that from the offspring of Abraham, blessings will come. And so she comes up with this logical, reasoned, natural, practical solution to their situation. It's a worldly voice. This practice was common in her time. It was under Hammurabi law allowed for a childless couple to adopt a child or to take a concubine, as Hagar is used here in that way, and to have an heir, to carry on the name, the inheritance of the family. We have learned in previous chapters, that chapter 15, that Eliezer, the servant within Abram's house, was ruled out of doing this. But Sarah argues perhaps God means us to arrive at this in another way. A custom that was common and accepted in her time. Later on in the Old Testament, Caleb and Gideon and Saul and David and Solomon and Rehoboam will have concubines. And here, Abram and Sarah adopt this method. So Abram's listening. He's listening to a desperate voice. He's listening to a reasoned voice. He's listening to a worldly voice, a culture and a custom that was familiar and acceptable in his time and place. I think his decision was wrong. I think it was wrong for a number of reasons. I think, first of all, God's pattern in Genesis chapter 2 is one man for one woman. I think David, I think Caleb, I think Solomon were wrong in having other wives. I think, secondly, the echo from Genesis chapter 3 indicates that what Abram is doing is the same as what Adam did. Adam's action was wrong in listening to his wife in that sense. And here the echo is Abraham, the father of a new generation, is also wrong in listening to his wife. I think God coming in chapter 18 and announcing that Sarah would be the mother of the heir is indicating that in this chapter they'd taken matters into their own hands. They'd stopped believing in God to fulfill his promise in wonderful ways, and they've sought to work out their own method. listening. Listening in a bad way. Listening to the wrong thing. Listening to the wrong idea. No husband should go home with this chapter and decide that he's never going to listen to his wife again. There are instances in the Bible of wives giving their husbands wrong advice. Eve to Adam, Job's wife to Job, you remember, cursed God and die. But there are also instances of wives giving tremendous advice to men or to their husbands. Abigail to David when he came to kill Naboth. Mary to the servants at the feast and wedding, do whatever he tells you. The Shunammite woman to her husband, let us build an apartment here for this prophet of God that passes by. Men should probably be listening more to their wives, even in those areas where we think we are competent, buying a new car, doing DIY. Perhaps our wives would actually have good input into those decisions and suggestions. So the men are not to go away home with this chapter and say, well, look at Abraham and all the trouble he got into. I'm never listening to my wife. That's not what the chapter is teaching. But it is teaching about bad listening. Donald Trump, in his recent speech, he talked about how he thought God was with him in that moment of the attempted assassination, preserving his life and also giving him peace in all the turmoil that ensued after it. He sought to look at his circumstances and understand what God was doing in his life. And that's hard to do that. And here is Sarai and Abraham looking at their circumstances and wondering what God is doing in their life and what they should do to address the problem that they were facing. We witness to an unbeliever, and we are always in this tension between, should I answer all their questions, or should I just pray for them, for God to work in their life? What are we to do? Are we to try, or are we to trust? We deal with an addict. We tell them that their ultimate need is for Jesus to come into their life. But is that all we tell them? Do we provide practical steps for them in dealing with their addiction? A young couple who cannot have children, are they to accept that this is God's plan for their life, or do they seek artificial means to have children? In many areas in our life, we are in the very same circumstances as Abraham and Sarah. And what are we to do? We learned of Abraham in a previous chapter when there was a famine in the land, and he went down to Egypt where there was plenty of food. And it's not easy for us to know when to try and when to trust. If we're just to trust as they were to do here, or if we're to trust and we're to try as Abraham did when he went down to Egypt. But there's 2 points that emerge from this first section in our chapter about his bad listening. Is that Abraham learned from his mistake here. And that's a brilliant thing for him, and a brilliant thing for us. We can make mistakes, and we will make mistakes. But can we learn from our mistakes? We have the saying, the man that never, and the woman that never made a mistake, never made anything. And there is tremendous truth in that. And the assumption is that we learn from the mistake. The man that makes the mistake learns from that mistake, and then he goes on to make wonderful things, avoiding those mistakes that he's already made. And so it is with Abraham. He makes this mistake of pulling matters into his own hands, but he learns from it. And we'll come to see him, the climax of his life of faith, climbing up Mount Moriah with his only son and doing everything that God asks him. Not taking matters into his own hands, not cutting corners, not listening to the voice of reason, going all the way, lifting up the very knife to plunge it into the chest of his beloved son. He learned from his mistake here to trust and rely and depend on God. And the second comfort that we draw from this paragraph is that we are like Abraham. We're not like Adam. When Adam listened to the voice of his wife Eve, there was all kinds of mighty repercussions came tumbling down on him, thrust out of the garden. But with Abraham here, he's in the age of grace, redemption, and acceptance. And he does wrong here. But in the next chapter, in the first verse, God's appearing to him. Because God's a God of forgiveness and restoration and love. And we're to go away from church today with this confidence and assurance as we remember our wrong turns, our listening to bad advice, the messes that we've got ourselves into, just like Abraham here. But God's love persists. His grace restores and goes on. So there's a tremendous paragraph here. Bad listening. But the second half of the chapter is about good listening. Verses 7 to 16. The Lord listened to your affliction. Isn't that tremendous? Here in this paragraph, in this section, there is this repeated mention of the angel of the Lord. This is the one who's listening. In verse 7, in verse 9, in verse 10, in verse 11, you would have noticed it in our reading. And he's mentioned throughout the Old Testament, especially in the historical sections. 58 times this person is mentioned, the angel of the Lord. And as we study those passages and this passage, we come to the conclusion that the angel of the Lord is not so much the representative of God, but the representation of God. He is God, come in the form of an angel. This is very clear in verse 10. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring. That can only refer to the Lord. So also in verse 13, Hagar identifies the one who spoke to her, that is the angel, as being more than an angel, as being the Lord. So here we have Jesus listening to this servant girl. Before he came in human form, he came from time to time in these 58 instances in the Old Testament to his people. My nephew was working with Deloitte for the past 2 months and has been offered a job with them. So he's gone to the company for a short time, but then if he takes this job, he will become a permanent employee of the company. So Jesus came for a time as an angel in the Old Testament, but then he comes permanently in human form at Bethlehem. But why did he come here? Well, he came to hear and to visit this suffering servant girl. She was treated badly by Abraham and by Sarah. She was the innocent party in this whole scenario that they got themselves involved in. When she realized that she was with child, she perhaps got a bit above her station And Sarai took this bad and increased the rigors of her servanthood, so much so that Hagar left home. And she's running towards her home, which was probably down there in Egypt. But it's in that moment of fleeing, a moment of loneliness, a moment of great sorrow, a moment of uncertainty, that Jesus comes to her and he listens to her. I have listened to your affliction. So this is good listening now. Not like Abraham, the bad listening. This is good listening. So what does good listening look like? Well, there's 4 attributes of good listening that we find in this paragraph. One aspect of good listening is that it's a habit. Later on in the Old Testament, we'll read of this same Hebrew word being used of God again and again. He listens at the time of the Exodus to the affliction of his people. This is his nature. This is his habit. This is his bent. This is his characteristic. Isn't this brilliant that he listens to the afflicted? And good listeners habitually listen to the hurting. Secondly, we ask questions. Some people are shy, some people are reserved, some people keep themselves to themselves, but with gentle, careful questions, we draw them out. We hear their trouble. We understand their sorrow. Here the angel of the Lord, verse 8, asks Hagar, where have you come from? And where are you going? He wants to hear her story, to understand her sorrow. Thirdly, good listening provides direction. The afflicted not only need our sympathy, need our listening ear, but they need our direction. You need to go and see a doctor. You need to get some financial advice for your financial troubles. We not only listen to the afflicted, but we provide practical direction for them. Here in verse 9, Jesus does this. Return to your mistress and submit to her. That was not what she wanted to hear, but that was the wise and the right advice that she needed to get. Good listening is a habit. Good listening asks questions. Good listening provides direction, and good listening offers comfort. Alongside of the direction to return to the home place, the angel reminds Hagar of God's promise. She will have a son, and from her descendants there will be many people multiplied. Alongside of the command and the direction is the comfort and the solace and the medicine of the promises of God. So in our listening, we remind the afflicted that God will never leave you nor forsake you. We remind the afflicted that God's purpose is over all our experiences. We remind the afflicted that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Good listening. Someone spoke to me recently about a child in our congregation under the age of 10 who studies to answer a question. That when you speak to this child, that the child pauses, absorbs your question, and then answers. And we can learn from that child among us in our congregation about good listening. That challenges all age groups, doesn't it? This good listening. The young people, they are accused of not listening to anyone. They know it, and as they grow, as they get their independence, as they make their own decisions, well, here's a challenge for you. To be like Jesus. And he's a good listener. Middle-aged people, we're accused of not listening either. We're too busy. There's so many things we have to do. We have no time to be thinking about other people or involved in their sorrows or troubles. We're struggling to manage with everything we've got ourselves. But here's a challenge for us. The Lord is a good listener. This one humble, insignificant servant girl, you listen to her. And older people, they think they should be listened to. That they have experience, that they have wisdom, that other people should be silent and they should offload all their wisdom onto them. Well, here's a challenge for you also. That you need to be a good listener as well. And for all oppressed today, for the bereaved, for the ill, for the troubled, for the people who are afraid about going back to school in due time, what a story this is for you. That Christ loves you, that he cares for you, that he sees you, that he listens to your sorrow. I wonder if Abraham prayed about Hagar. I wonder if he was deeply regretful about all that had happened in his home and the fractious relationships that developed. And I wonder if this visit of Jesus was an answer to his prayer. Lord, I messed up here. This should never have worked out the way it has. Please look after that servant girl as she heads off to her homeland in Egypt. And perhaps in answer to Abram's prayer, Jesus comes and listens to her. And whether that happened or not, it can happen for us. That in those circumstances in our life which don't work out the way that we thought they would work out, and we're upset and troubled about them, we can pray, Lord, come to that hurting person. Come to that troubled people and hear their prayer and answer them in your grace. So how are we listening today? Are we listening like Abraham badly to the wrong people, to the wrong things? Or are we like Jesus here, a good listener? In this holiday Bible Club week, we might hear things that are strange to us about dark and difficult home lives. Will we be good listeners? The emphasis in this week, of course, is that we are the teachers. And we'll be trying to get the young people to be quiet many, many times in the next 4 days. But in the presence of all that teaching and all that desire for peace and reverence and quietness, remember this sermon, that we are also to be good listeners.